Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all of you. Before we really begin, we're about to begin, we allowed a few more minutes for latecomers to just join us. But we would like to, we knew this was going to be a more intimate, a smaller gathering, but we didn't want you to, use the full real estate we have available. If you would be so kind to all just gather in this area here. This would make for a more intimate, a closer experience. If you'd be so kind, all of those, let's fill the first 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 rows, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. And then as we speak, kindly note that this whole event is being streamed live and that there are multiple participants elsewhere. And they are all welcome to tag in and to use social media to participate in this event as appropriate. If you need any detail on that, I could ask my colleague to explain that, but I'm sure especially the young people would know what that all entails. So please, colleagues over there, would you be so kind to sit here in front? Okay, they need some leg space. Okay, thank you very, very, very much. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome our speaker and friend, Professor John Lennox. He's our guest of honor and speaker. And ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you too. We would like to ask Professor Henk Stoker to open this event with reading from the scripture and prayer.
I want to read 2 verses from the Christian Bible, and it's interesting, it's 2 verses also accepted by other major religions. In Genesis 1 verse 27-28 and Genesis 2 verse 15. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth, work it and take care of it." Work it and take care of it. God created us creative and gave us a place to fulfill our creativity while doing our work and caring for what we had received. Work it and take care of it. Our work is to fully explore the world's potential through research, planning, and practice. While doing it, we should also care for it, because the physical world was created for a purpose, was created good, beautiful, balanced, and provide a basis for significance. Work it and take care of it. That means our business life and conduct are a moral one. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can be together and to think and to discuss this world that you have created and that you have put us in. And we pray that you will make it not only beneficial for us, but that everything will be to the honor of your name. Amen.
Thank you, Professor Stoker. Ladies and gentlemen, the program will entail a short welcome by the Dean of Theology in his absence. I will do that. I will, however, see if he arrives. He's late from another meeting. And then a brief opening and introduction by myself. Then Professor Lennox will speak for almost an hour. And after that, we'll have 45 to 50, 60 minutes for questions and answers. So this is going to be, I believe, one of those events in your life where you will remember I was there in that audience. The 2 thus far at Northwest University, I remember 2 years ago, this auditorium was packed to capacity. And then last year, the auditorium was back to capacity. And today we have this wonderful opportunity with the business chamber. This is the highlight for the business chamber. It's actually requested by them, and it is about ethics and business and so on. And tonight will be yet another major event in the amphitheater. We all invite you heartily to that event. But I guarantee that these two events will be in your memory for always. This is what happened to me last time. I remember the content and the atmosphere and what was said. It was very dear to me. So, on behalf of the Dean of Theology, let me welcome you to Northwest University. This is a public institution. If there are people of any other faith than the Christian faith in this audience, you are welcome. If there are atheists, you are welcome. We are a public institution, and diversity is what we have to observe at all times. But borrowing from Professor van der Wald's statement the other day, this is exactly a diverse experience in that we are inundated with so many arguments and opinions out there in the secular world, notably forcible arguments by the so-called new atheists. And the fact that it's not so new is something to observe, but nevertheless, that as a university, we would like to expose our staff and students, in actual fact, to also be a catalyst for exposing the public to a thorough and a wide opinion, to seek with us truth. They say pure science is both universal and self-correcting. And I believe as citizens of the country, as believers, that truth is what it's all about. And it does often seem, if you read the media, as though the truth from one side and the truth from the other is at loggerheads, and that cannot be. So this is a probing discussion into truth as well. So, but just back to the university, we have 8 faculties. We are the second largest in South Africa, for those who don't know. If you count heads, we have a fairly large distance component of about 30,000 students, but 40-something thousand contact students. We have not had the green light to publish this, but in the small audience for our own consumption, I believe we have also earned 4 stars on the QS latest ranking. We are very happy about that. So we could say that this university is in good company. We are specifically in good company if we are honored and can be honored to have people like Professor John Lennox frequenting us, at least visiting us the 3rd time already, and we trust and hope and we pray, Prof. Lennox, that this won't be the last opportunity. So I'm not going to say much more about the university. You are welcome to visit our website. We are very, very happy and very proud to host you today, and we trust that you will enjoy the day with us. So I am going to introduce Professor Lennox, but just before I do that, just want to say something for those who cannot attend tonight. The events are really the consequence of a collaboration between a number of organizations. One is Ratio Christi, which is the Latin for the reason of Christ. It's a global movement that equips university students and faculty to give historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for following Jesus Christ, bringing together faith and reason to establish the intellectual voice of Christ in the university. Ratio Christi is planting student and faculty-led apologetics clubs at universities around the world. Students engaged in the battle for the mind learn to defend God's existence, the reliability of the Bible, and the fact of Christ's resurrection. We seek a resonance of Christian thinking and, renaissance of Christian thinking in the university. Then the Institute for Faith and Science, they say scholarship from a Christian perspective is practiced in an increasingly skeptical environment. Therefore, a discussion about the integration of the religious foundations and science are still and even more necessary today. This is a long-standing debate within Christian circles, but skeptics and people with convictions different from that of the Christian perspective should also be engaged. The Institute for Foundational Studies serves in this context to promote reflection on and dialogues between religion and scholarship. Then I already said something about the Business Chamber, who's one of the initiators and supporters of this event. In their instance, it is all about ethics in business. And I am excited to hear what Professor Lennox has to say about that. Briefly about the faculty, who's our primary host. The Faculty of Theology of the Northwest University practices the science of theology on reformational foundation. This implies recognition that the Word of God, the Bible, originated through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and the Bible is therefore inspired and authoritative. This is the basis on which all paradigms, including our own, are subjected to constant critical and reformative study, while accommodating staff members and students of other theological persuasions who respect this reformational foundation and inclusive approach. So I have the honor now to introduce to you our speaker. You can Google Professor John Lennox. You will find multiple links, video clips, YouTube clips. His work, body of work he has given us is formidable. And he's also modest. He said to me, scratch that, but let me at least give you a short synopsis. Professor John Lennox is Professor of Mathematics, emeritus. He said to me, well, the word emeritus means I'm old, but he doesn't look old to me. In actual fact, he doesn't seem to have changed a bit since we saw him last year. He's at the University of Oxford, and he's also a fellow in mathematics and philosophy of science. He's a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. I do think some people know what that is. And an associate fellow of the Said Business School in Oxford. In addition to over 70 published mathematical papers, he is the co-author of 2 research-level texts in algebra in the Oxford Mathematical Monographs series. He is interested in the interface between science, philosophy, and theology. His books include God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God, and God and Stephen Hawking, and Gunning for God. Now, if you have read about science, philosophy of science, and related themes, you will have noticed that Professor Lennox has debated a number of atheists, neo-atheists, and the like very successfully. And he has exposed the fact that many of the scientists of our day, who are quite knowledgeable about their own fields, if it comes to these issues, often appear like, if I may say this with respect, the village atheist. Because there is very little substance in the philosophical underpinnings. So, Professor Lennox, we are excited to listen to you, and I'd like to just pose a question. I'm not skipping any of the questionnaire rows, but you're a mathematician, and you're a fellow of the Said Business School. What is the connection?
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Professor Van Niekerk. It really is an honor for me to be back in this wonderful university. I remember so well my previous visit and the marvelous way I was entertained and looked after. And it's just wonderful to be back here again, and thank you very much for your welcome. Your question has come to me many times. What is a mathematician doing in a business school? It's a long story, really, but it came about when my college in Oxford, Green College, merged with Templeton College. Now, Templeton College, you may know, was endowed by Sir John Marks Templeton, the philanthropist, as really forming the heart of the Oxford Business School community, running MBAs and all this kind of thing. But they lost their buildings and they had money, and we had buildings and no money, and the marriage was arranged. And so Green College and Templeton College merged to become Green Templeton College. And we were encouraged to meet our new colleagues, and we had various dinners. So on one occasion I was sitting beside one of the senior members of Templeton College, and we noticed that we were each wearing the same tie. And that tie is a very famous tie. You buy it in the Oxford Natural History Museum, and it depicts the dodo, which is an ancient extinct bird. So we both had the same tie. So I said to my new colleague, whom I had not met before, I wonder, have we anything else in common? He said, I doubt that very much. And so we explored a bit, and he was an expert in management. But he said, I run seminars for leaders in business. I said, oh, really? And he said, in Oxford, in our Oxford Strategic Leadership Program, we try to be very innovative. And amongst the seminars we run, we try to involve the arts and literature and philosophy in getting business leaders to think outside the box. So I looked at him and smiled. I said, I do that sort of thing. He said, no, you don't. I said, I do, actually. I occasionally will run seminars for fairly high-powered people from business, politics, law, and so on. And it proceeds on analyzing literature and discussing particularly the questions of ethics and leadership that arise. And he was completely dumbfounded. And then he took a huge risk. He said, would you like to do it with us? Well, I said, that would be very risky, wouldn't it? Well, I've been doing it now for many years, and it has been a very interesting part of my life, because as a pure mathematician, I'm dealing with very abstract things that are extremely precise. And what I've come to learn about the business community is it's certainly not abstract. There's a bottom line. And it often isn't terribly precise. And that's what makes it extremely interesting to me. So for some years, I've been part of the Strategic Leadership Program. And what I do is I play Socrates. He's one of my intellectual heroes from the Greek world. And his stock in trade was to irritate people by asking them questions. And he was at the end accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, and he was forced to commit suicide by drinking hemlock. So it's risky to ask questions. But nevertheless, I keep asking these questions. And so I sit with typically 25 or 30 business leaders from around the world, sometimes Fortune 500 CEOs, and we read a bit of Plato. And then I simply sit and ask questions and watch to see what happens. And it's utterly fascinating what comes out, because you see, Plato was so upset at the death of Socrates, who was a genius, that he thought, what is wrong with our world that a man of these qualities has to commit suicide? And he decided he was going to think through what the ideal state should be like, what an ideal leader needed in their qualifications. Now, I had some fairly crazy ideas, with which I sympathize, by the way, because Plato thought that if you're going to be a leader, you needed to have done mathematics for at least 7 years. So, but we leave that aside. I've since learned that that is not actually necessary. So you might be relieved to hear that. And he wrote the famous book, The Republic. And so that's often what we use in this kind of circumstance. Now, that has led me to many things. And one of them in particular is a strong link with South Africa. You may have heard of the Tutu Fellows program. The Tutu Fellows are young business leaders from a wide variety of businesses in this country, and they are, without exception, brilliant. And one of my rare privileges, and again it happened by accident, someone came on one of these other programs and then came to me and said, look, we're bringing all these Tutu Fellows to Oxford. They have this special program in the summer where they come to Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, and one or two other places for a week at a time. So I've had the privilege of running this kind of a seminar every year for the last 5 or 6 years for all the Tutu Fellows. And it has been such an enlightening thing. to me. I've learned so much, although I feel I'm in a country where I know very little. So that's my connection with this, because what we're discovering is that leaders need some kind of out-of-the-box thinking to orientate themselves in the complexities of modern life. Now, in addition to that, I find in my lecturing, and it has been up until recently around the world and frequently, students in universities, when they're asked, what do you want to hear about? Often the answer is, it's changed a great deal. But one of the most popular questions I get asked is, what is human flourishing? And what is well-being? And what is success? So I've had to address these questions. I don't regard myself an expert in them. I have a little bit of age. I'm in my mid-70s, so I've been around a bit. But it's been most interesting opening up some of these topics to students. And I'm reminded of Winston Churchill, who once said that success is going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. So there's an encouraging quote to start us off this afternoon. And there are many things one can say about this, and they may well come into my talk. But one of the things that really struck me that I read some time ago is this: management is efficiency in climbing the ladder of success. Leadership determines whether the ladder is leaning against the right wall. Now, that's a quote from the famous Stephen Covey, who many of you who are in business will have read. But all of us in this room are interested in success by definition. And that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. We heard that ancient book quoted at the very beginning, that we were created in part to make a good job of being stewards of the resources that we find on this planet. And right here, Potchefstroom, we're right in the middle of one of the wealthiest sources of resource on the entire planet. So this is the right track. And I know from my experience that all of us are interested not only in being successful, but making sure our ladder is leaning against the right wall. And that is not necessarily a very easy thing. Now, I submitted a series of possible lecture titles for today, and the one that was chosen is one that I've called Smart Cities and Smart Ethics. Because when you think of the concept of being successful globally, one of the things that's come to the fore in the last decade is the notion of a smart city. And I gather there's quite a bit of competition in this country between Joburg and Cape Town. But I'm not going to take any sides in that, so don't worry about it. But a smart city has been described by the engineering consultancy Arup as one where the seams and structures of the various urban systems are made clear, simple, responsive, and even malleable through technology and design. A smart city happens when three specific networks interact: the communications grid, the energy system, and the logistics internet, which can track people and things through transport and supply systems. And one writer imagines it like this: a woman drives to the outskirts of the city, steps directly onto a train. Her electric car then drives itself off to park and recharge. A man has a heart attack in the street. The emergency services send a drone equipped with a defibrillator to arrive crucial minutes before an ambulance can. A family of flying maintenance robots lives atop an apartment block, able to autonomously repair cracks or leaks and clear leaves from the gutter. And so on and so forth. We're all aware of these quasi-utopian visions that drive the rhetoric of the smart city that has been, particularly in the last 10 years, promulgated very actively by big technology, engineering, and consulting companies. Now, of course, smart cities depend on universal broadband, the embedding of computerized sensors in the urban fabric, bike racks, lampposts, CCTV, traffic lights, or robots, you call them, as well as home appliances such as smart fridges, remote-controlled heating systems, and they become part of what has come to be described as the Internet of Things. And the global market for that at the moment is standing around $2 trillion. Better living through biochemistry gives rise to a dream of better living through big data. And some universities, particularly University College London, offer a degree, an MSc in smart cities and urban analytics. Big data is one of the most important things to have happened. The very sophisticated techniques to get useful information out of vast amounts of data. And we hope that Moore's law continues to operate. That is, that computational power will be doubled every 18 months for the same size of chip. And apparently, every 2 days, we create as much data as had been created in the history of the world up to 2002. Every 2 days. And therefore, big data is a resource to be mined, just as important as the gold mines down the road. And in particular, great strides are being made in the key area of artificial intelligence, roughly defined to be the capability of a computer system to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. And yesterday, in the Times, Matt Ridley reported that AI already pervades our lives to a surprising extent. Technology exists to wake you at the right part of the sleep cycle, allows you to select a radio station using a digital assistant, avoid traffic jams by live updates of the GPS, determine disease in a scan, detect potential bank fraud, and so on and so forth. And just last week, Carnegie Mellon University announced that they have got so far as to develop an artificial intelligence algorithm that will not only automate the carrying out of experiments to develop the best high-capacity car battery, but will plan the experiments and automate the decision-making stage. And this is being hailed as a huge breakthrough. Now, the aim of some researchers is to perfect what's called neuromorphic computing. That is to develop computing technology that works on the same principle as the synapses in our brains. And there's a lot of hype about this, but some notable things have been done in terms of speech recognition and so on. Taking your cue from biology to increase by major factors computing power. Elon Musk has plans for linking computers directly to the human brain so that they can type what we think. Because AI attempts, at least in part, to imitate the human brain. Now, we need to be clear about this. Chess-playing computers like Deep Blue are not regarded as artificial intelligence because they do not play chess in the same way as humans do. They simply crunch huge banks of data, considering 14 moves in advance and so on. But what people are striving for is a neurologically inspired computer that will work, learn, develop memory, and so on. Now, as this moves forward, ethical questions begin to emerge. Al Rodon of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, in a recent article for the UN Economics Forum, says that red flags emerge at the moral level. Building neuromorphic chips, he says, might mean that we create machines as intelligent as humans. These technologies are demonstrations of human excellence, yet computers that think could be devastating for our species. And as Marvin Minsky has put it, they could even keep humanity as pets. Elon Musk thinks that AI is, quote, summoning the demon. And just last year, Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, said that he fears that artificial intelligence may replace humanity altogether. He called for the technology to be controlled to avoid it destroying the human race. Now, there's huge hype here, and it's very hard to separate the science from the science fiction, because they're leading scientists saying this is absolutely marvelous, we should go as far as we could, and they're leading scientists giving great warnings. Ray Kurzweil, who's very famous in this area, he thinks that robots, not traffic lights, but robots in the other sense, will be considered conscious and take over most human tasks by 2030. Now, what's at risk here? Many of you are members of the business community, and what you are naturally concerned about is your job and the job of your employees. Now, the survey that was done in 2013 by Frey and Osborne reckoned 47% of jobs in the US were at high risk of automation. Yet in 2018, this year, there's a new OECD report that says that only 14% of world jobs are at risk. Mind you, that's 66 million. But it does say that increased automation will inevitably produce social inequality and hurt the poor the most. The number of jobs in automation will increase, but here in South Africa you have a person at UCT called Ralph Hamann, and he says this is going to be especially a problem for this country, because retraining people to be highly skilled in the area of automation is extremely difficult and very expensive. So there are all these issues at stake. And just today, I read the Times even when I'm in South Africa. Just today, let me see, I quoted directly from the paper itself. These iPads are wonderful. This is Bill Gates. And he says, quote, "It's only a matter of time before robots replace humans in a substantial number of jobs. Work won't be the central, almost religious activity it is today. That's an inevitability," he said. Then, and I want you to notice this, then you'll all have all sorts of philosophical questions about purpose. What is life going to be about when there is a huge decline in jobs? So with this as a little background, smart cities would seem to demand smarter ethics. And now we hit the first major obvious problem, because smart ethics seems to be in short supply. Computing power doubles every 18 months. Do you think in the global business community and in the political communities, ethical integrity doubles every 18 months? Why is there such a disconnect between our progress technologically in what we can do and our ethical status, our commitment to a concept of what is good and what will lead to true human flourishing? Indeed, you responded by a little titter of laughter, I noticed, because you suspect, as I do, that there's a negative inverse correlation. The more rapidly automation increases, the less ethics keep up with it. And the money that's been poured into AI is colossal. President Macron has announced that he wants to make France the AI capital of the world. The Chinese aim to dominate the world in this area by 2030. And the director of Cambridge University's Centre for the Study of Existential Risk said this year, "We live in a world that could become fraught with hazards from the misuse of AI, and we need to take ownership of the problems, for the risk is real." Now, one of the greatest risks in the world today has been brought to our attention, particularly in the UK and the US just recently, with the relationship between Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Is that something you've heard about here? No doubt it is. The mining of huge amounts of information that many people didn't know they'd actually parted with, being given to this company, and it's raised massive ethical issues about the matter of privacy. 2.5 billion of us in the world voluntarily wear a smart tracker. It's called a smartphone. And it's pumping information into cyberspace that is being harvested. Who controls these projects? Who owns the data that is generated? This is now, and we're seeing the tip of the iceberg, this is becoming a major problem. Not simply for me as an individual, or you as corporate people, or universities, but the whole global interconnected network of things. Privacy. How important is privacy? And one person responded to the smart city scenario, said, if you want smart cities, you have to pay the price. That price is privacy and control. Personally, I'd prefer to live in a stupid city, but I doubt if I'd be given that choice. Now, one of the most scary things about privacy is a development that is occurring at this moment in China. Now, in 2017, $197 billion was spent on domestic security in that country. And they expect that they will install 400 million CCTV cameras by 2020. Now, here's what's happening with part of the population. It was a major article last weekend in the Times. You wander across the road, not waiting for the robot to go green. Or a neighbor informs the local authority that you put coffee grounds in a shared recycling bin. Or you were late paying your council tax. And you'll possibly never know what you've done wrong, but one day you go into a restaurant and you suddenly discover two people appear, big burly people, and put you out in the street. You don't really know why. You go into a railway station, you find you can't buy a train ticket, or you can't fly anywhere, or you can't buy certain goods like a motor car, and so on. When people call your phone, the ringtone is changed into a blaring police siren, followed by a very loud electronic voice that people around you can hear, identifying you as a discredited person. And eventually, as you're walking down the street, your face appears on a huge screen and lists you as a discredited person. Several million people in China are experiencing this today, according to this article. And by the end of 2020, Beijing intends to give each of the 1.3 billion citizens a social credit score that measures his or her trustworthiness and rectitude. Almost every aspect of their career, to the speed of their internet connection, will come to depend on this single number. And it starts with 300 points, I believe. And 30 experiments are being carried out in cities at this very moment. And you can earn more points by paying your debts on time or making responsible-looking purchases. You get points for good deeds with a moral or civic dimension, such as donating blood, taking public transport, or snitching on a cousin with a secret stash of foreign currency. As your score rises above 500, you might get discount on your broadband, a fast-track visit to Europe, or if you live in Guangzhou, a free 3-day test drive of the latest Ford car dispensed by a giant car vending machine with cat ears. You can lose points by frittering away your money on frivolous luxuries such as alcohol or computer games. That's scary, isn't it? Because it's coming towards almost complete social control. Some people are suggesting that these plans are the perfection of a dictatorship, of an authoritarian dream world, and the danger is it will spread around the world like a virus. Now, the article goes on to point out that all these systems are present in the West, but in a distributed form. That is, there are different companies doing different things. There are the CCTV surveillance things. There's the credit scoring technology, and so on and so forth, the harvesting of information, etc., etc. These are all distributed among various companies. They're here today. But what they're doing in China, apparently, is bringing the whole thing together under one number. So there is deep concern. We mentioned it over Facebook and so on. And there are many other areas we could mention. We could mention cybercrime, cyber war, and all kinds of hopes of cyber immortality. Kurzweil suggested that one day we'll be able to download the contents of our brain onto silicon and so make ourselves immortal. And this week, coming, there are the TED Talks in Vancouver. And Max Tegmark, who's just written a brand new book on this, he is the president of the Future of Life Institute at MIT and a brilliant professor of physics. He will argue that, I quote, "In creating AI, we're birthing a new form of life with unlimited potential for good or for ill." And that's the problem. Society must grapple with the dilemma of preserving people's privacy and ownership of their data while letting machine learning algorithms harvest insight of value to everybody. Perhaps it's time, ladies and gentlemen, to reflect on Mahatma Gandhi's statement, "There is more to life than increasing its speed." Is there more to life than computer enhancement, AI, and robotic companions? Is there a danger that we're all willy-nilly moving towards a machine-dominated society where the moral character of human beings plays a diminishing role? Isn't it ironical that we start by wanting as much choice as possible and we end by abdicating our choice and delegating it to a machine that is usually programmed by someone other than ourselves and therefore embodies their decisions and not ours? And what are we going to do? Because Bill Gates raised the question that the biggest issue for us is going to be in this smart world, what is our purpose? We're very good at analyzing what we are made of. And some people take a very radical view. Biologist Jerry Coyne, our brains are simply meat computers. That's a fairly radical view. But there are strong objections to these ideas. It's one thing to say that in certain ways the brain functions like a computer. It's another to say that it is a computer. And as you study the history of thought, you see that people's ideas of the brain have always proved to be immensely short-sighted. For example, hydraulic engineering was invented in the 3rd century BC, and for 1600 years, intelligence was thought in terms of fluids. Descartes favored the imagery of machines. Freud thought the brain was similar to a steam engine, and a century ago, it was thought to be like a telephone exchange, and now a computer. But it's interesting that there's a school of psychologists and cognitive scientists that are rowing against this idea and completely reject the idea that the brain works like a computer. And one author, Roger Epstein, who's an editor of Psychology Today and a senior researcher, discusses babies. Newborn babies come into the world equipped with powerful learning mechanisms that allow them to change rapidly so that they can interact increasingly effectively with their world. So senses, reflexes, and learning mechanisms, this is what we start with. But here is what we are not born with, says Epstein. Information, data, rules, software, knowledge, lexicons, representations, algorithms, programs, models, memories, images, processors, and so on and so forth. And then he makes this very provocative statement. Not only are we not born with such things, we also don't develop them ever. Computers do not play games like humans play games. Computers do not create like humans create. Computers at their most fundamental level do not even solve computational problems like humans solve computational problems. We will therefore never succeed in downloading our minds onto a computer. We will not succeed in creating a computer whose so-called intelligence is anything like ours. But the danger is, according to this group, that a flawed metaphor inspiring false fears will lead us to miss the real problems with AI. And the real problem is what? It's blindly depending on machines, lulled to trust them by bad metaphors. The danger is that computers will fail us, and possibly do so in very bad ways. Now, in light of all of that, we have to ask a basic question. At the heart of it all are human beings. The danger is that at various levels, increasingly, what we as humans can do is being substituted by what increasingly sophisticated machines can do. And so that raises the question, not of what we are, it does that, but the even deeper question, what is our purpose? The hardest question facing AI, according to Tegmark in his new book published yesterday, is what do we use AI for so long as we can control it? We may lose control, but what purpose are we going to assign to it? Well, what are we? Is my brain simply a computer made of meat? Or is there more to it than that? Let me give you a simple illustration. We have been brilliant, and the Greeks were as well, at asking a profound question, what are you made of? And we're good at that. We know what we're made of to a certain extent. But they asked another question. What are things made for? Suppose you are an SUV salesman, and you sell me an SUV. And being a good salesman, you come to see me at home after 6 months. And you say, how are you getting on with your SUV? Oh, marvelously. I say, come and see. So you come out into the garden of my home, and there it's sitting in the middle of a vegetable patch. And inside it, you can immediately see there are glorious big tomatoes growing in the front and in the back. And you look at this in amazement, and I say, do you know, this is marvelous. I've won the tomato show for the last 6 months simply because I found in this thing, there's a thing called AC, and if I turn it up to 3.2, I get the best tomatoes in the whole of the Cape Province. Now, what would you do as a salesman? I think you'd say to me, before you took me to a psychiatrist, you'd say, but that's not what it's for. But we laugh, don't we? But tell me, ladies and gentlemen, what are you for? Have you ever asked yourself that question? What are you for? We know what we're made of, and it goes wrong, and the doctors repair it, and it's marvelous. But the deeper question is, what are we for? And the smart city scenario raises it more and more deeply. What's it all for? Well, there are many people, particularly the new atheists who are quoted, who say, well, there's no ultimate purpose. And here is, ladies and gentlemen, where we've got to do what is called worldview thinking. Because we need to see what lenses throughout history people have looked through to try to settle these big questions. And really, there are not many possibilities. There is the materialistic worldview that everything reduces to physics and chemistry, and there's no transcendence, and there's nothing more. Then over against that, there is the theistic worldview, the biblical worldview in my case, which says that there is transcendence. This is a material universe. My body is made of material, but I have been created as a human being in the image of God, as we heard read to us. And then there is another worldview that I'm not going to discuss today at all. That's the pantheistic one, where the universe and God become conflated, and ultimate reality is completely impersonal. And John Polkinghorne, who taught me quantum physics at Cambridge, says this: if we are to understand the nature of reality, we have only two possible starting points. Either the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. Now, even mentioning God in certain places, particularly Europe, appears very threatening to people. For they instinctively fear religious totalitarian fundamentalism that sometimes violently imposes one religion to the exclusion of everything else. On the other hand, there are many people who fear fundamentalist atheistic naturalism that bans God from the public space. And we've got a lot of that in Europe. And one extreme can lead to the other. But we don't have to live at the extremes. And ladies and gentlemen, where I come from, the University of Oxford, it has a motto, Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my light or my illumination. These great universities were founded as religious institutions by people that saw no conflict between believing in God and the most active of intellectual activity. We cannot today, in the 21st century, when thinking about human beings, smart cities, smart ethics and purpose, we cannot avoid talking about God. It is a sad indicator of the state of our culture in Europe that the European Constitution, is it 900 pages long, doesn't use the word God once. 1,000 years and more airbrushed out of our history so that we lose that sense of identity. The point I want to make now as I come to allow you to ask questions is very simple. All of us in this room have a worldview. And I'm going to just take those two, the atheistic worldview and the theistic Christian worldview. And what we make of ourselves, those that work for us, those whom we lead in our corporate activities, depends critically on that worldview. You see, there's a current bestseller by a physicist, Sean Carroll, a book called The Big Picture. It's a very interesting book. But he says we humans are blobs of organized mud, which through the impersonal workings of nature's patterns have developed the capacity to contemplate and cherish and engage with the intimidating complexity of the world around us. The meaning we find in life is not transcendent. We're organized mud. Well, we're computers made of meat. We're just machines. Now, you know, if you're working in the corporate section and your machine doesn't work, what do you do with it? You replace it, and you don't think about it. If you are simply a machine, and people begin to really think that, then it's very easy to replace machines. Now, historically, we've seen that happen. We've seen it happen in the communist world again and again and again. Stalin once said, what is a generation? If we lose an entire generation, so what? And I'll never forget, I spent a lot of time in Russia, you see, because I've been interested in why people think what they think. And I will never forget a number of senior academics, and I've heard this many times in many places, but the first one was in Siberia. And he said to me, he said, we thought that we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. And we found we couldn't, but it was too late. And Solzhenitsyn said, if I am asked why 100 million of my fellow citizens had to die, he said the short answer is, we have forgotten God. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we're faced with extremely sophisticated ethical questions. How are we going to solve them? If we have no transcendent vertical connection, then in the end, ethics are just a matter of my opinion and your opinion. And we in Europe are seeing exactly what the consequences of that are. Often, if you ask a class of students to name a moral dilemma, their answer will be, what is a moral dilemma? We're beginning to see the consequences and the fulfillment of what Dostoevsky said a long time ago. If God does not exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean atheists couldn't behave well. Of course, that's nonsense. What he meant was that there's no intellectual, logical base for morality if you don't have a transcendent dimension. And what I'm suggesting to you, particularly those of you from the business community here, is we need to think about this very hard. Your employees will know exactly what you think of them. And the more you have something to look up to yourself. There was a survey done in Germany some years ago where it was found, to utter astonishment, that management in Germany had a far higher percentage of belief in God than the nation as a whole. So they redid the survey, and this was a purely secular survey. They redid the survey and asked all these managers, why do you believe in God? Why is it important? And they said, I, as the boss, as the CEO, I need someone to look up to. I need an anchor for my ideas. Now, I discovered this in my seminars. It is amazing how many people are desperate for meaning at this level. And what I'm suggesting to you, simply by raising these questions, is that we're in a world where we're being pressurized in two directions. There are the articulate atheists telling us, like Richard Dawkins did, that there is no good and no evil. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Well, that's the end of all morality. Or there are other people saying, look, we need to get back to the thing that gives you the biggest dignity of any philosophy or religion. And it was read to us at the beginning. And God made human beings in his own image. Male and female, he created them. Have you ever thought about what that means? If that's true. You see, the universe is glorious, especially as seen from South Africa. But the stars were not made in God's image. They show his glory. They weren't made in his image. You were. That gives you an infinite dignity. And you know, it's one of the things I learned from my parents. I come from a sectarian country that was riven by violence, Northern Ireland. And my own father's business was bombed repeatedly. My brother nearly lost his life. So we know all about violence. But what I saw in my parents was this. They believed that statement. And they believed it of everybody, whatever they believed or not. And so my father employed across both sides of the religious divide as equally as he could. That's why he was bombed. But it was because he believed that every man and woman was created in the image of God. Just think what effect that belief would have if put into practice. That you look at your employees and you say, each one of these people is of infinite value. I need to be careful how I treat them. And you look up to those who are above you and you do exactly the same thing. It would be utterly transformative, except for one thing. Except for the fact that we find that we are broken people in a broken world. And we find we can't do it. And that, of course, is why, well, I say of course, it may not be obvious to you, but it's why I'm actually a Christian. It's because there I find not only an analysis of the problem, but a God who's approached me and come into this world to do something about the brokenness in my own life and the fact that I've not only made a mess of my own life, but made a mess of other people's lives. Is there any power that can deal with that? Education doesn't deal with that. Education can, as was once pointed out, make very clever saints and very clever devils. But we need a power that is prepared to forgive us and accept us. Now that would lead me way beyond this topic. But I hope I've said enough just to raise in your mind some questions that we can now discuss. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Lennox, for the thought-provoking presentation. As usual, you have a way with words. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for questions and answers. You are welcome. There are 2 roving microphones. May I ask you to please not engage in long statements or so, but very short, succinct questions. We will gather a number of questions at a time, 3, 4, 5 or so. Professor Lennox will indicate to us when he's comfortable to answer a bunch at a time. And we'll have that a number of times. So please put up your hand if you have a question. Someone over there, I hear a voice. Could you please supply the microphone there?
I will write the questions down, and then I will say something about them. Okay. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Professor.
Good afternoon, I think, actually.
All right.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you. It's basically just a clarification. Before you started speaking, he asked you a question.
Yes.
That how come you are a mathematician, and also, I didn't hear the other part. Would you like to clarify for us? Or maybe you can repeat the question, because he said you are a mathematician and you are also something else.
Oh, I see. Yes, you didn't hear it.
No, I didn't.
Okay, I'll say something briefly about that.
Okay, thank you.
In a minute. All right, next question. Number 2.
My question, Professor Lennox, has to do with, as we were driving down from Johannesburg today, it's difficult to listen to these advanced technical people because in some sense Africa, you're driving past people who are living in corrugated iron shacks, and we seem to be dealing with much more basic things, people just trying to get 3 meals a day, and this technological world seems, how does this fit what you said into perhaps our South African context as best you can, given your background coming from Europe, just in an African context?
Okay, thank you. Number
That's
3.
clear. Number 3, please. There's another one.
Hello, Professor Lennox. So, a common idea that we get in terms of how we should treat individuals in terms of human dignity and so on, especially with regards to their social standing and how society treats individuals, we would often get some kind of narrative or idea that the idea of God as an authority imposing absolute moral laws and the idea of almost imminent, non-reducible individual dignity that we cannot, for the sake of a society or for the sake of expedience, override. That those are just ideas to protect individuals in terms of, say, capitalism or something, to protect the owners of capital. And whereas we as a society should look at society as a whole, and therefore, by doing that, implementing something like the social credit program in China or something like that would be justified, because when we look at what's the most possible good for the most possible people, what does it matter if we have to sacrifice a couple of individuals to do that, or a couple of rights?
Okay.
Shall we take a fourth question and then ask Professor Lennox to speak?
We'll have a fourth and then we'll see
There's a
what
fourth question over there, over here, and then, sir, I saw you. We'll come back to you.
It's just there was a lot said on AI. I just would like to know your comment on that, because I felt it was a whole lot more of criticism rather from scientists. And this has happened before. People in the field making predictions and not turning out to be so. I mean, even with the use of personal computers, this was never thought to be possible. Or rather, yeah.
Sorry, I can't quite hear. Did you hear?
Yeah, I heard some of that. She's asking about, and help me, I paraphrase, the whole world of AI, all the examples you gave, seems to possibly exaggerate or overestimate what could happen if one would look at other trends in the past where rather alarming forecasts were made, which didn't materialize eventually.
Which didn't happen.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Was that right? Okay. Let's
Thank
take
you.
these questions. So I'll come back to you in a minute. Just hang on, please.
Well, let's have a think. Thank you for these questions. Now, of course, this is a Q&A, ladies and gentlemen. And you know what that means. That it's a highly inadequate process, because you will plumb the depths of my ignorance. That's the first thing. And the second thing is I can only react off the top of my head how I begin to approach the questions. If the question is yours and is a real question you have, the more important thing is the work you do on it after you leave here. But let me try and think about these questions. The first one was, what was the point of the question at the beginning? It was how I, as a research mathematician, got involved in a business school. And I think I answered that. That was what the question was. And of course, there's a deeper answer to it than the one I did give, because I'm very interested in what makes people tick, whatever their background is and whatever their profession is. And I've been privileged in life to get involved with many different kinds of communities. The academic community is one, the business community is another one. And I like to go and find out what it is that pressurizes people. What are their problems? So, for example, when I found I was asked to address large groups of insurance executives, I went and spent a whole day from morning to night sitting at Lloyd's insurers to see what happens, what a broker has to do. And that was very enlightening. So it means now when I've got 50 or 60 insurance people, I've got some sense of the pressures on them, because I'm interested in my fellow human beings. And I'm interested, as a Christian, in how Christianity can actually relate rather than theoretically relate to them. And that's one of the reasons. It's just given me an opportunity to get outside of the mathematical box. Now, the second question is entirely justified, and that the majority of people, not only in South Africa but around the world, are dealing with much more basic things. They're dealing often at the level of survival, of basic existence. And therefore, what relevance has all this discussion? Now, first of all, I speak on this topic because I was invited to. Now, I'm not using that as an excuse, but I'm using it as a fact that it seemed to me that being invited to talk of this meant you were interested in it. Second thing is that somebody has to think through this stuff because it is coming and has arrived in many parts of the world. Now, when you find yourself in the middle of this, you as business people, as people giving employment and therefore in the end paying people who are finding it by definition, unless your business isn't working very well, they're finding it more difficult to live than you are. The important work in this has to be done at the level of the individual businesses and employment situations. It won't be solved theoretically, and it certainly won't be solved by someone like me coming and simply talking about it. What I wanted to do this morning was to paint a big picture. This is what is going to hit us, and is already hitting us. And therefore, we have to try and sort this out. And it would be very important and a wonderful thing if out of this university there were to come really entrepreneurial thinking people who were able to bridge that divide. You cannot come to this country, or indeed to ours now. Think of Oxford, where there's almost full employment, but there are people sleeping in the doorways every night all around the city. And it's an utter scandal. And Britain, many people are living way below the poverty line. It's not only happening here, it is perhaps a little bit more obvious here than it is at home. In the United States, it's the same. And therefore, we have a responsibility to begin with us. What can my community, what can I do to try to redress this? Now, a very interesting question that was related to that was the third question that came immediately after it. I don't know whether it was precipitated by it, and was a comment on the social credit program and saying perhaps that would be a better thing. And I'm very glad you raised that question, because your thinking was a lovely example of utilitarianism, as I think you realize. The maximum benefit for the maximum number of people. Now, that raises a much broader set of questions, as you probably realize, because utilitarianism is, particularly in its preference form, is the view that's favored by the world's leading ethicists, at least those people who are counted as such, including Peter Singer, who's one of the main people, Peter Singer of Princeton, whom I debated some time ago. And the idea is this: look, why not put up with a bit of loss of freedom in order to maximize the benefit? Now, there is a certain amount of soundness in that, as you suspect, that some people appear to have too much freedom to exploit others, and they get away with robbing the nation. You may know this. I was surprised a little bit by this. I was reading a report by the World Economic Forum, and they said, what is the biggest drain on finance globally? And the answer is corruption. And the loss to individual nations and their subjects through corruption is absolutely spectacular. And your point is, and I take it, your point is right. If we clamp down on everybody, then maybe it will result in a fairer situation. And this appears to be a pretty draconian way of doing it. It's Big Brother watches you to the extreme. Now, I simply recorded it as a fact. I find it scary. But I realize that having the balance between cherished freedoms and imposed discipline has been a problem since the very dawn of human history. It's a huge problem. You see, we voluntarily limit our freedoms to an extent in order to enjoy things. Now, there was a big rugby player sitting who asked that second question. And as far as I can see, I mean, I was hopeless at rugby. I couldn't run fast enough, and I wasn't big enough, and I had all the disadvantages of being just the wrong sort of person. But anyway, here is a group of people, and they voluntarily submit to the captain. What, to spoil the game by having imposed on them? No. They need a captain in order to play the game. And it's true at all kinds of levels in society, in your companies. I bet you not everybody's the CEO. It just doesn't work that way. Because the frameworks that we have developed are, we hope, if we take an altruistic view, the frameworks are developed in order to make the thing actually work. Now, the problem with your solution, utilitarianism, works in many areas. Now, utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethic. That is, we should always factor into our decisions what the consequences are going to be. That is a very sensible thing to do. For example, if you're dividing ice cream among children, you'd better be a utilitarian. The maximum benefit to the maximum number of people means dividing that ice cream millimetrically equally, doesn't it? Woe betide you if you don't. Everybody's a utilitarian when it comes to splitting up ice cream. But now let me change the scenario. You see, let's just imagine that here's a man in the front, and he looks fit and strong, and he's a world-famous rugby player, and the nation just adores him. But unfortunately, he needs a heart transplant if he's going to survive. And beside him is a brilliant musician, famous the world over, charms everybody. But he needs a new kidney or he's going to die. And just across here is a lady, and she's an opera singer, absolutely brilliant. But she needs a lung transplant. And beside her is another lady, and she is a brilliant novelist. And she needs a new liver. So here's a very healthy chap over here. There are 5 people that need all these things. So we take this healthy chap, we put him to sleep gently. We remove his heart, give it to you. Remove his lungs, give them to you. Remove the liver, give it to you. And the kidneys, give it to you. So there are 5 people that have benefited. And only 1. So that's fine, isn't it? What would you think? Especially if you're the chap over there. You see, the point I'm making, and it is a serious point, Hitler took that view. What are 6 million Jews? They gassed them. Because the majority, apparently, as he thought, it wasn't true actually, but wanted rid of them. Or all the other genocides and things that have happened around the world. Utilitarianism is limited. Because in the end, the evaluation of the individual can go to 0 for the benefit of the majority. Now, that brings me back to what is the foundation of ethics? Now, if you don't have a God dimension, well, that is the preferred view in the world. But because I have a God dimension, and looking at the whole history, the fundamental of ethics and morality have been biblical for centuries. It's an interesting fact, but it is. And it's recognized by one of the world's leading atheist thinkers. His name is Jürgen Habermas. And he says, look, the only real source from which we live today, and I'm paraphrasing his words, is the Judeo-Christian tradition. We have no other possibility. And all of our notions of human rights, fairness in civil intercourse, and so on, it all comes from there. And then he adds something very interesting. Everything else is just idle postmodern chatter. That's a very interesting statement. It's in a book called Übergänge, Transitions, that he wrote some time ago. So my response to you is to say, yes, there appears to be a lot of sense there. But when it comes down to it, you wouldn't want to be the one that's sacrificed for the many. And therefore, we've got to retain some way of maintaining that individual dignity, but not allowing that to be a license for any particular individual to rob the nation, so to speak. And that happens far too often. But that depends on civilized behavior in governments and right down to the family. You know, what frightens me as a parent, and I have 3 children and 9 grandchildren, is this. I watch in Europe people being taught that they're only computers made of meat. People being taught that they're merely machines or merely animals. And then I watch the consequences. They start to behave like that. So what we've got to do, at least in our own surroundings, is to teach basic values and where they come from. Europe is in mass confusion at the moment because nobody can answer the question, who said so? Now, part of your question, I'm going to say just a little bit more about it. Are we nearly out?
We have time, so you can continue.
Have we a minute or two?
Yes.
There was another very interesting part of your question, if I got it right, and that was the authority narrative that people resent. The minute anybody asks this question, I see Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, and I was debating him in the Edinburgh Festival. And he said, your God is like a North Korean dictator in the sky, always watching you. And to see if you're having fun and he's going to spoil it. Who would want that? And I just said to him, I said, Christopher, that makes me so sad. And I'm going to tell you why it makes me so sad. Because it's an extreme caricature. Who would want somebody watching you all the time? I've got someone who watches me all the time. She's called my wife. Well, how can I put up with that authoritarian imposition of a dictatorship? Well, because it isn't. Because the difference is she loves me. Your North Korean dictator in the sky is a total caricature. God has revealed himself in Christ as a God of love. And I'm thrilled to bits he's watching me. Because I understand from what he's revealed that he's interested in my life. He gives it a value and a dignity. He guides it. He fills it with meaning. So I'm absolutely thrilled that he's watching me. It depends how you twist the narrative. There are good authorities and bad authorities. And so it's important to really analyze these things and see what are we saying. Now, I'm well aware, and I suspect there's a backstory to what you've said. And what I suspect it may be is this. Professing Christians have, throughout history, often been authoritarian little tin pot dictators and have exploited people that they've gone to. Well, that's shameful, utterly shameful. And my response to that, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, is that Christ wasn't like that. I said to Hitchens once, I said, Christopher, I don't understand you. You listed all the bad things about religion. And I said, I simply agree with them all. But the interesting thing is, Christ pointed all these things out. He was against exploitative religion, arrogance, authoritarian imposition. And he opposed it. I said, you should be on his side because you're exactly with him. You're coming from exactly the same position. Well, that was a new idea for Christopher Hitchens at the time. Now, the last question was that the danger of promises not being fulfilled. And there are many voices in the AI community saying, look, there's far too much hype here, talking about downloading the mind, saying we're going to have thinking computers by 2030 and all this kind of thing. Why don't we just wait and see? Because it's not likely that a lot of this stuff will be realized. And you see, behind that, and I sit with them very much, is the fact that this notion that we're going to build a human being might come unstuck. Because you see, back to that biblical statement which is so profound, we are made of material, but God breathed into man the breath of life, and human beings became living souls. I can't breathe the breath of life into a computer. In fact, we don't even know what the breath of life is. Suppose someone shot me right now and I'm lying dead there. All my atoms and molecules are still there, but life is gone. So what is gone? We just don't know. There's so much we're utterly ignorant of. And what is more, we talk about computers becoming conscious, but we don't know what consciousness is. We haven't the faintest idea. So I'm a little bit with you who asked the question, saying it might not be as extreme as all of this. So perhaps we should wait and see, because very often people have made extravagant claims and they have never come to pass. But the good thing from my perspective, and my perspective is limited, the good thing is I find in the business community, coming back to the community I was asked to address, I find many people who have very prominent positions in this world, they are desperate for an answer to these questions. They don't know who they are really, because they're being told they're merely material, and that doesn't work. That doesn't work for them for very obvious reasons. But where do I now go? And I believe that my little job is to try to get them to think again about something they may have rejected long ago because they heard a distorted version of it, that you need to bring God back into the equation.
Thank you very much, Professor Lennox. I remember the gentleman over there had a question. So prepare your questions, please. Can we have a microphone up there? We have a first, sorry, can we just take that one? I recognized the gentleman quite some time ago. And then secondly, you, sir. Please go ahead.
Professor, quite rightly you referred to the God dimension and the imperative that we as believers have. But in my experience, what's seriously lacking, and that's the question to you, don't you think it's the power of love, and more particularly the love of God as the first foundation of a fruitful and a purposeful life? Because what I find in music, you've got intrinsic laws. They lie in the scales and progression and so on. In physics, you have your laws like, what do you call it again when a thing falls down?
Gravitation.
The law of gravitation. You've got your laws in economics, you know, with demand and supply and so on. But don't you think it's quite astounding that modern man has a total disregard for the intrinsic spiritual law? When Jesus was questioned by the scribes and Pharisees about the law and the prophets and so on, he said, listen, I can sum it all up in two verses, two sentences. Love God with all your heart, your mind, and your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And I honestly believe that is the thing that's lacking in society today, is a real love of God and a love of your fellow man, to be treated in the way you would treat them.
Okay,
Thank you.
very
We
much.
take that question. There's another one here.
Dear Professor, what I actually wanted to ask is that as South Africa, we are a developing country. So the ethical issue when it comes to us enhancing our knowledge in artificial intelligence, I just want to ask, is it the wrong direction that we can be steered in as a country, or is it a good thing that we want to enhance our knowledge and be like one of those countries like China and America to like enhance our knowledge in artificial intelligence? Is it a good or a bad thing that we also want to
Sorry,
do?
can you just
haven't got it.
rephrase the question there?
Okay. What I mean is that artificial intelligence, I've heard there's ethical issues and major disadvantages with that. So I just wanted to ask, is it a wrong thing that as a country we are trying by all means to enhance our knowledge and learn more about it?
So is it good or bad to engage in any AI work here locally, having noted the abuse, potential abuse and dangers and risks? Another question? In the corner there? Last row?
Do both of you want to come down?
Okay, here's a question and another one up there. Then we'll take those four and we see how much time we have after that.
Look, Professor, when you spoke about the Russian situation, when the guy said, when we took God out of the occasion, we ended up devaluating human life completely. I thought a lot about it because I think what got them in the first place was complete over-evaluation of the individual human value of human life. The same thing in Europe today. The social world, we focus so much on the value of human life, we take God out of the equation, and the overemphasis of the human value. Then that's my question. Is it the overemphasis on the value of human life that always leads to the complete devaluation of human life in the end?
Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Mabu?
We seem to experience a fundamental contradiction here. On the one hand, we find with respect to AI and also particularly the new atheists, that they adhere to a materialist ontology. They say everything is matter. And yet, they seem to ignore the position of the human body, which makes us just as human as the mind or soul does. And they tend to ignore, in particular, the vulnerability of the human body. So why is it that a materialist framework is not more sympathetic towards our experience as vulnerable humans?
Thank you.
Okay, thank
Shall
you.
we take these few, Professor?
Right. Well, let's think about these questions. We'll start with the last one. Your question is new to me, and that I welcome greatly, because one of the values of these Q&As is they make me think, and that's why I like them so much. I hadn't had that impression, so I'm going to have to think my way through this as I respond to you. And you mentioned the new atheists and those who are materialists, and there are many who are materialists. Dawkins is a thoroughgoing materialist, and so was Stephen Hawking. Why aren't they more sympathetic to human experience? Now, and the vulnerability of the body. Now, I'm not quite sure, I'm going to ask you a question now, you see. I'm not quite sure what you're saying there, because experience is a mental thing. And what kind of experience do you find they're not sympathetic to? I mean, I have many atheist friends, not the new atheists so much, but many atheist friends, and they're very sympathetic people and very understanding people. So can you make more precise the point that you were making? Or am I misunderstanding you completely?
Yes, perhaps I should just rephrase. Why is it that the problem of AI basically flows from a materialist framework? Sure, it's implied, the mind is implied in it, but they speak constantly of the downloading of the human consciousness and so on. But in this whole process, the role of the body in who we are is ignored. And perhaps the word sympathetic, of course they're sympathetic on an individual level, but I've never seen a reflection by either an atheist or a person promoting AI who really reflect upon what it means to be a physical, mortal human being?
Ah, I see. Well, let me try and say something. It may be utterly inadequate, but you'll have to do the research then. There is an interest in stopping mortality. I think many of these people are aware of their mortality, only too aware of it, and that's why they're talking about downloading themselves onto silicon so that they can have some kind of eternal life. It's the contemporary artificial intelligence version of seeking for the elixir of life. And they certainly are aware of that. And they are aware of their own mortality, but they're hoping that they may one day be able to overcome it. So I'll have to limit it there, we'll not get to these others, but I wish you well in your research trying to answer that question. So let's look at these other things. Is it our overemphasis on the value of human beings that leads to their devaluation? I wouldn't quite understand that, really, because having spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe during the Cold War and in Russia after the Cold War, it seems to me that if you think of the 20th century alone, more blood flowed in the 20th century than all the previous centuries. And as far as I can see, that analysis that the Russian intellectuals gave to me is absolutely correct. Rivers of blood flowed because of the devaluation of human beings. And that wasn't a reaction to an overvaluation. It was narrowing down human beings in their value. Now, I'm tempted here to give you a very lengthy lecture that will bore you to tears. But the book of Genesis gives us the best approximation to a definition of life in the sense of what does life mean that I've ever seen. Because in its account, it talks about human beings being made of the dust of the earth. There's so much material. It then talks about them being in an environment, a garden, where the trees were good to look upon and good for food. And that reminds us that we've got an aesthetic sense. We enjoy the environment, especially here in Africa. So we've got the aesthetic sense. It then tells us about the rivers that flowed out, and if you followed the rivers down, you could find gold. That speaks to us about human curiosity about the environment and what we can do in developing the environment. Then it talks about work, that they were put in the garden to work. Now, I'll just stop there. There's much more to it, because the climax of it is a relationship with God that is morally defined. They were allowed to eat of all the trees except one. So you're now investigating the essence of morality. But if I take the one element there, work, the communists reduced human beings to working machines. And that was very evident in East Germany, where I spent a lot of time during the Cold War. Once a person had finished their working life, if they had any relatives in Western Germany, the relatives would often be asked to buy them out, get them out. They've finished their work, they're no more use, we don't want to pay them a pension, you take them. They were simply working units, the worker class. And the problem in our world is that as you look at those different levels, basic material, aesthetic sense, work, developing out of curiosity the environment and so on, you will find in many cultures where one of these things becomes overemphasized to the exclusion of almost everything else. And that is what happens. It's not an overemphasis on the value of humans, it's a reduction of humans to concentrate on simply one aspect. So if you reduce them, and reductionism is a very important philosophical term, because that's what we're talking about in all of this debate. It's reducing people to machines. And if my computer doesn't work, I might as well take a hammer to it and replace it. And that's exactly what happened. People stopped work, so they took a hammer to them. And I was recently watching a documentary on the building of a huge canal in Russia. And when breaches opened up in the concrete, they simply threw the workers in to block and poured the concrete in on top of them. That huge devaluation of humanity, it didn't come from an over-evaluation. So the other question was, let's see. I can't read my own writing here. Oh, it was that artificial intelligence, is it a good thing to develop in South Africa? Well, you're too late to ask the question, because there are various institutions here in South Africa engaged in it, one just up the road in Johannesburg. But a lot of these things that are developed by the human mind are two-edged swords. I wonder, do you have a factory that makes surgical equipment? I bet you do. Well, a surgical knife can be used to save your life. It can be used to murder somebody. And artificial intelligence has, and they're warning us of the risks. But the reason they're warning us of the risk is that the risks are of a totally different kind from any risk we've faced before, if these people are right. Because the risk they're predicting is that the AI robots become so human that they simply take over from us. We've never faced a risk like that before. Maybe we never will. But that's the risk they're trying to prepare us for. Now, is it a good thing or a bad thing? You can think of huge benefits. All of you, I bet most of you have a smartphone, which depends largely on artificial intelligence. You use social media and all the rest of it. So we're all using the benefits of it. And I'm so glad there are surgical knives in existence. But I realize that if you make them, you risk evil people using them to murder folks. We live in a world where that kind of freedom is necessitated by our nature as human beings. That's a huge question. And I'm going to leave that question because I've just written a book on it. And you probably find it around the place. It's on determinism and free will. But the last question, which was the first question over here, the love of God and the question of love, are they central? They are absolutely central. And you see, when I talked earlier about the value given to people, that's another way of saying this, but it's important we say it both ways. And when it came to what is the heart of the objective of ethical systems, Christ put his finger on it. Love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the interesting thing is, I would almost go as far as to say that the second half of that is hardwired into every human being. C.S. Lewis in the 1940s pointed out, he'd done research on dozens of different philosophies and cultures around the world, all religions and none. And he discovered in every one of them, he discovered the golden rule. And you can do that research for yourself. I've done it because it's so interesting. We seem to be hardwired with that sense of an ethic that's based, otherwise I believe the whole of humanity would simply fall apart. We don't start in a vacuum when it comes to ethics and morality. But the thing that's missing is very much the vertical sense of not only believing in God. Please notice the exact quote that was given to us. Loving God. That's a concept we don't talk about enough, and I would be happy to talk about it at great length, but we haven't got the time for that now. I'm simply going to say this, that love is a very personal thing. And you'll only love God if you believe that God is personal and not a force, as in Star Wars. And to me, it is the central thing. All of us find the most meaning in life in a loving relationship. We are relational. Why? Because we're built in the image of God. And God is, how can I say it? We use the word Trinity, but let me be slightly more informal. God is a fellowship. And we are made in his image. We're made for fellowship and friendship. And there is not the slightest doubt in my mind that people are, as the questioner pointed out, they are most influenced by those who love them and demonstrate that they love them. And if we are those who simultaneously are loving God with our minds, God isn't anti-intellectual, by the way. We can love him with our minds. Not only believe in him with our minds, but love him with our minds. Then that is the basic stuff, so to speak, to influence society around us. Because you know as well as I do, if someone senses that you love them, they'll listen to what you have to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Lennox. If there is one last urgent question, we can entertain that. We have a few more minutes, but I have the feeling that we've probably exhausted the questions. Would that be right? Thank you very much. So I have already introduced the organizations responsible for this event. I wish to thank all the organizations again. I wish to thank Professor Stoker and his absence, Professor Balia. And now I would like to thank our speaker, our guest. Prof. Lennox, it is clear to me that when you speak with your opponents, you treat them with such respect. You practice what you preach. You're never obnoxious, you're very intellectual, and you're very loving when you speak with people, even your opponents. And that is a clear characteristic of what you say and of how what you say, how we should live. I said last time when you were here that as a university we are blessed to have among the best of minds visiting a university like this. A university is supposed to be a concentration of talent, and I think in a sense it is. If I might be frivolous for a while, they say university is a fountain of wisdom and knowledge, and students go there to drink. But that's not really what I mean if I say we have a concentration of talent. And can I say, and I've listened to over the last almost 2 decades, probably to 3/4 of the inaugural lectures and all of the other lectures that have been presented here, and you always stand out. I'm very, very happy to share with the audience what you said, that your visits to Noordwes-universiteit, particularly Potchefstroom, has always been for you very special. And we trust and we hope that we will have the honor again to see you again. And thank you so much. We are looking forward to tonight. We trust you will have some time to rest a while. It's been an exhausting trip. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation and presence today. And feel free to join us again tonight. Thank you.